In a small town nestled in the heart of Missouri, where everyone knew each other by name and Friday fish fries were a sacred tradition, stood the Sunrise Diner. The establishment had been a community fixture for decades, but things had changed since Bob Thompson took over 2 years ago. The once welcoming atmosphere had slowly transformed into something colder, driven by Bob's ruthless pursuit of profit over people. On a crisp autumn morning, when golden leaves danced across the cracked parking lot, Mr. Chen walked through the diner's door. At 89 years old, the Korean War veteran moved slowly, leaning on his weathered cane, his Navy veteran cap worn with quiet pride. The morning rush had just ended, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered among the worn leather booths. Mr. Chen had been coming to the Sunrise Diner every Thursday morning for the past 30 years. It was more than just breakfast for him, it was a connection to the community he'd served and loved. The waitresses used to know his order by heart: 2 eggs over easy, crispy hash browns, and black coffee, always served with a warm smile and friendly conversation. But this Thursday was different. As Mr. Chen made his way to his usual spot, Bob's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the diner. "Hey old-timer, you can't just sit here nursing one coffee for hours anymore. Times are changing. Either order a full meal or find somewhere else to waste time." The diner fell silent. Regular customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the waitstaff looked down at their notepads, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Chen stood there, his dignity under assault, but his back remained straight as it had been during his years of service. "I've been a customer here for 30 years, Mr. Chen replied softly, his voice steady despite the hurt in his eyes. "I always order my breakfast and leave a good tip." Bob snorted, his voice getting louder. "Well, 30 years ago is ancient history. This isn't a retirement home or a veterans club. It's a business, and I need paying customers who don't take up space." What Bob didn't realize was that Tom Weber, a regular at the corner table, was not just any customer. He was a member of the local motorcycle club, the Steele Brothers, known throughout the region for their community service and unwavering support of veterans. Tom sat quietly, his coffee growing cold, as he recorded the entire interaction on his phone. As Mr. Chen slowly turned to leave, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of the humiliation, several other customers stood up in protest. Mrs. Rivera, a retired schoolteacher, called out, "This isn't right, Bob." But the diner owner merely waved them off, already turning his attention to other matters. What happened next would spark a chain of events that would remind the whole town about the true meaning of respect, community, and standing up for what's right. Because while Mr. Chen walked home alone that morning, his story was already spreading through the tight-knit motorcycle community, igniting a fire that would soon remind Bob Thompson about the true cost of forgetting our heroes. As the video began circulating in the Steele Brothers private group chat, the usually laid-back Tom typed out a message that would set everything in motion. "Brothers, we've got a situation. One of our own needs us. Meeting tonight at the clubhouse. This can't stand." The autumn wind picked up outside the diner, scattering leaves across the empty parking spaces where, unknown to Bob, dozens of motorcycles would soon gather. The small-town diner owner had no idea that his actions that morning would not only change his business forever but would also reveal the true heart of a community that had never forgotten the value of respect, honor, and standing up for those who had stood up for us. That evening, the Steele Brothers clubhouse buzzed with unusual activity. The converted warehouse, normally quiet on weeknights, was packed with members who had dropped everything to answer Tom's urgent call. The video of Mr. Chen's humiliation played on a projector screen, its images casting long shadows across the concerned faces of dozens of bikers. "I've known Mr. Chen for years," Tom addressed the gathered crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "Every Memorial Day, he's there at dawn, placing flags at the cemetery. Never asks for recognition. Never wants attention. Just serves his community like he served his country." The club president, a gray-haired man known as Pop, stood up. At 72, he'd been riding motorcycles longer than many members had been alive. His weathered face carried the wisdom of decades spent building bridges between the club and the community. "This isn't about revenge," he announced, scanning the room. "This is about education. About showing what community really means." As the night progressed, the Steele brothers crafted a plan that would teach Bob Thompson a lesson he'd never forget, not through intimidation, but through the power of community and compassion. Word spread through the town's veteran networks, local churches, and social media groups. The response was overwhelming. The next morning, life at the Sunrise Diner continued as usual. Bob strutted around, barking orders at his increasingly disgruntled staff, unaware of the wheels already in motion. The breakfast rush came and went, leaving the usual mid-morning lull. That's when they heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycles, growing louder by the second. Bob rushed to the window, his face paling as he watched bike after bike pull into his parking lot. Within minutes, the entire lot was filled with gleaming motorcycles, their chrome catching the morning sun. The Steele brothers weren't alone. Behind them came a parade of cars carrying veterans from 3 different counties, families with children, teachers, nurses, and countless other community members. The diner's parking lot hadn't seen this many vehicles in years. Pop led the way through the diner's door, the bell chiming frantically as dozens of people filed in behind him. Every booth, every counter seat, and every table was soon occupied. The waitresses, who had witnessed Mr. Chen's mistreatment the day before, couldn't hide their smiles. "What's the meaning of this?" Bob demanded, his voice lacking its usual authority. Pop approached the counter, his leather vest decorated with military service patches. "We're customers," he said simply. "Here to order breakfast. All of us." The diner's kitchen soon found itself overwhelmed with orders. The Steele brothers and their companions were unfailingly polite, each leaving generous tips for the staff. But they also made sure to mention Mr. Chen to anyone who would listen, sharing stories of his contributions to the community. Mrs. Rivera, who had been there the previous day, returned with a photo album. She set up at a corner table, showing anyone interested the pictures from past Memorial Days, 4th of July parades, and veteran events. There was Mr. Chen, younger but still recognizable, volunteering at the local school's Veterans Day program, teaching children about service and sacrifice. As the morning wore on, more people arrived. When the parking lot overflowed, they parked along the street. The line stretched out the door and around the building. Every customer asked for Mr. Chen's usual table, making sure to mention his name. Local news reporters began showing up, drawn by the unusual sight of hundreds of bikes parked outside a small diner. When they asked what was happening, Pop simply said, "We're supporting a local hero and reminding ourselves what community means." The Steele brothers had achieved something remarkable. They'd organized a protest that felt like a celebration. There was no anger, no confrontation, just an overwhelming display of community solidarity that was impossible to ignore. By lunchtime, Bob Thompson stood behind his counter, watching as his diner became the epicenter of a movement he never saw coming. His staff worked tirelessly, but instead of their usual stressed expressions, they moved with purpose, energized by the atmosphere of respect and unity that filled the space. The day's events were teaching Bob Thompson a lesson more powerful than any angry confrontation could have delivered. Every time the bell above the door chimed, it seemed to echo with a simple truth: a community's strength lies not in its buildings or businesses, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the story of the Steele brothers' peaceful protest began spreading across social media. People from neighboring towns started arriving, each one asking about Mr. Chen, each one ordering a full meal, each one leaving knowing they were part of something bigger than themselves. The Steele brothers had transformed a moment of shame into a demonstration of community power. But their plan was far from over. This was just the beginning of a movement that would change not just Bob Thompson's perspective, but the entire town's understanding of respect, honor, and the true meaning of service. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the packed diner, something unexpected happened. Jenny, the longest-serving waitress at Sunrise Diner, approached Pop with tears in her eyes. She'd worked there for 15 years, serving countless plates of eggs and coffee to Mr. Chen and watching the diner change under Bob's management. "Mr. Chen isn't just a customer," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Every Christmas, he brings small gifts for all the staff. Last year, when my son was struggling in school, he spent hours tutoring him in math. He never asked for anything in return." The stories kept coming. The cook, who had remained silent until now, emerged from the kitchen during a brief lull. He shared how Mr. Chen had helped him practice for his citizenship test 3 years ago, spending countless mornings going over questions between breakfast orders. Meanwhile, Bob Thompson sat in his office, watching the security cameras with growing unease. The diner had never seen such business, yet he felt no joy in the profits. Every time he glanced at the monitors, he saw another person sharing a story about Mr. Chen, each tale chipping away at his hardened exterior. Outside, the Steele brothers had organized an impromptu community gathering in the parking lot. Someone had brought folding chairs, and another person set up a small tent to shelter waiting customers from the sun. The atmosphere was more like a town festival than a protest. Local business owners started showing up, not just to support the cause, but to share their own experiences. The hardware store owner recalled how Mr. Chen had volunteered to help repair the store's roof after a bad storm, despite his age. The librarian spoke about his weekly visits to read to children, sharing stories about his service days in a way that captivated young minds without glorifying war. By mid-afternoon, the local radio station had picked up the story. The DJ, broadcasting live from his car in the parking lot, started taking calls from community members. Each caller had a different story about Mr. Chen's quiet acts of kindness, how he shoveled neighbors' driveways in winter, taught young veterans about VA benefits, or simply offered a listening ear to anyone who needed it. The Steele brothers' peaceful demonstration had evolved into something bigger, a celebration of community service and gratitude. Pop noticed Bob watching from his office window and decided it was time for a conversation. He knocked on the office door, waiting patiently until Bob reluctantly opened it. "You know," Pop began, his voice gentle but firm, "sometimes we get so caught up in running a business that we forget we're running it in a community. Every person who walks through that door brings more than just their wallet, they bring their story, their struggles, their triumphs." Bob tried to maintain his defensive posture, but Pop could see the cracks forming. "This isn't just about Mr. Chen anymore, is it?" Bob asked, finally voicing what he'd begun to understand. "It never was," Pop replied. "It's about who we choose to be as people, as a community." "That veteran you turned away? He spent more years serving others than most of us have been alive. But he never stopped serving, even after hanging up his uniform." Outside, the crowd had started singing, an impromptu rendition of "God Bless America" led by the high school music teacher. The sound filtered through the office walls, carrying with it the weight of community unity and purpose. Bob moved to the window, watching as children ran between the parked motorcycles, their parents chatting with leather-clad bikers as if they were old friends. He saw his waitresses smiling for the first time in months, serving food with pride rather than fear. The diner had come alive in a way he'd never seen before. "I made a mistake," Bob admitted, his voice barely audible above the singing outside. "But I don't know how to fix this." Pop smiled, placing a weathered hand on Bob's shoulder. "That's the beauty of community, when we admit our mistakes, we find people ready to help us make things right. But first, there's someone you need to talk to." As if on cue, a hush fell over the crowd outside. Through the gaps between parked motorcycles, Bob could see a familiar figure making his way toward the diner. Mr. Chen, supported by his cane and flanked by 2 Steele brothers members, was approaching the entrance. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the opportunity for redemption. But what happened next would depend entirely on whether Bob Thompson could see beyond his ledger books and recognize the true value of a community's heart. The bell above the diner door chimed as Mr. Chen stepped inside, its familiar ring now carrying the weight of anticipation. The bustling dining room fell silent, conversations fading to whispers, then to nothing. Every eye watched as the elderly veteran made his way forward, his cane tapping softly against the worn linoleum floor. Pop stayed close to Bob, who stood frozen behind the counter. The diner owner's face had lost its usual harsh lines, replaced by an expression of uncertainty and growing recognition. Through the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the counter, highlighting the decades of coffee stains and the countless meals served to generations of townspeople. Mr. Chen stopped a few feet from the counter, his back straight despite his years. The veteran's cap sat proudly on his head, its medals and pins telling silent stories of sacrifice and service. The diner's usual sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the clink of coffee cups, the hum of conversation, had all ceased, leaving only the soft whir of the ceiling fans. "Mr. Chen," Bob began, his voice barely above a whisper. He trailed off, words failing him as he faced the man he had wronged. The elderly veteran regarded him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You know," Mr. Chen said, his voice gentle but clear, "when I first came to this town after the war, I didn't speak much English. I was afraid to go anywhere. But this diner." He gestured around the room with his free hand. "This place welcomed me. The owner then, old Joe, he would sit with me every morning, teaching me English over coffee and eggs." Several of the older customers nodded, remembering those days. Mrs. Rivera wiped tears from her eyes as she listened from her booth near the window. "This diner became more than just a place to eat," Mr. Chen continued. "It became a place where a stranger could become family. Where a young man who had seen too much could find peace in a cup of coffee and a kind word." Bob's hands gripped the counter edge, his knuckles white. The transformation happening on his face was visible to everyone, the hard shell of business-first mentality cracking under the weight of human connection. "I've been running this place all wrong," Bob admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I looked at the numbers, the profits, the turnover, but I missed what makes a business truly successful in a small town. I missed the heart of it." From somewhere in the crowd, a child's voice piped up, "Mr. Chen, are you going to tell us the story about the helicopter again?" The tension broke as gentle laughter rippled through the diner. Mr. Chen's stories were legendary among the town's children, exciting enough to capture their imagination but always carrying subtle lessons about courage, kindness, and perseverance. Bob came around the counter, moving slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Chen, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you, and this whole community, a change. This diner was never meant to be just a business, it's supposed to be a home." The elderly veteran looked at Bob for a long moment, then smiled. It was a smile that had welcomed countless troubled veterans to the local VFW, that had reassured nervous children on their first day of school where he volunteered, that had brightened countless mornings in this very diner. "In my culture," Mr. Chen said, "we believe that every mistake is an opportunity to learn, to grow wiser. The question is not whether we make mistakes, we all do. The question is what we learn from them." Pop stepped forward, placing a hand on both men's shoulders. "What do you say we make this right? Not just for today, but for good?" Bob nodded, then turned to address the crowded diner. "Starting today, things are going to be different at Sunrise Diner. We're bringing back senior coffee mornings. Veterans eat at half price, always. And Mr. Chen." He turned back to the elderly veteran. "Your breakfast is on the house. For life. More than that. I'd be honored if you'd help me understand how to make this place what it should be, a true community hub." The diner erupted in applause. Jenny, the waitress, hurried forward with tears in her eyes, carrying a fresh cup of coffee, 2 sugars, just how Mr. Chen liked it. The cook emerged from the kitchen with a plate of eggs over easy and crispy hash browns, made exactly the way he'd been making them for Mr. Chen for years. As Mr. Chen settled into his usual spot at the counter, the Steele brothers began to disperse, knowing their mission had been accomplished. But Pop lingered, watching as Bob pulled up a stool next to Mr. Chen, eager to hear the helicopter story that had so intrigued the children. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the sea of motorcycles. The impromptu community gathering in the parking lot had evolved into a celebration of unity, with people sharing stories, laughter, and the simple joy of being part of something bigger than themselves. The story of the Sunrise Diner would be told for years to come, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a reminder of how a community could come together to protect its own, and how even the hardest hearts could be opened by the power of understanding and compassion. The following weeks brought remarkable changes to the Sunrise Diner. The transformation began with small touches, old photographs appearing on the walls, showing the diner's history through the decades. Among them was a faded picture from 1973, showing a young Mr. Chen sitting at the counter, studying English flashcards with old Joe, the previous owner. Bob had discovered these treasures in a dusty box in the storage room, remnants of the diner's legacy he'd nearly discarded during his modernization efforts. Now, each photograph told a story, creating a timeline of community memories that customers could follow as they waited for their meals. The physical changes were just the beginning. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The rushed, impersonal service was replaced by a warmth that reminded longtime customers of the diner's golden days. Bob had taken down the 90-minute maximum seating time signs and replaced them with a new motto, where friends become family. One morning, about 3 weeks after the incident, Mr. Chen arrived to find something new at his usual spot, a small brass plaque embedded in the counter. It read, "Reserved for Mr. Chen, honorary diner historian and community hero." The elderly veteran's eyes misted over as he ran his fingers across the engraved letters. The Steele brothers hadn't disappeared after their successful intervention. They'd become regular customers, with small groups stopping by throughout the week. Their presence had an unexpected effect. Younger veterans, some struggling with their return to civilian life, began showing up too. They found in the diner a safe space where they could talk with older veterans who understood their experiences. Bob's education in community building continued daily. He learned that profit wasn't just about the money changing hands, it was about the value created in human connections. The diner's books showed something surprising. While people were staying longer, they were also spending more, bringing friends, and returning more frequently. The change in Bob himself was perhaps the most remarkable transformation. He started joining Mr. Chen every Thursday morning, not to discuss business, but to listen. He heard stories about the Korean War that history books never mentioned, about the challenges of building a life in a new country, and about the small acts of kindness that had made all the difference. One particular Thursday, Mr. Chen brought in a small, worn notebook. "I want to show you something," he said to Bob, carefully opening its pages. Inside were handwritten English phrases, each one marked with a date from the early 1970s. "Old Joe wrote these for me, one new phrase every day." He said learning a language wasn't just about words, it was about belonging. The diner's revival sparked something larger in the community. Other business owners began reconsidering their approaches. The hardware store started hosting monthly DIY workshops for kids. The bookstore created a veterans reading corner. Small changes, inspired by the diner's example, began rippling through the town. Jenny, the longtime waitress, noticed another change. Customers who had stopped coming during Bob's harsh management started returning. They'd hear about the transformation and come to see for themselves, often leaving with tears in their eyes and promises to return. The local high school's history teacher began bringing students to the diner for what she called Living History Thursdays. They'd sit with Mr. Chen and other veterans, learning about history from those who had lived it. The teenagers, initially skeptical, found themselves captivated by stories that made their textbooks come alive. One morning, a young reporter from the county newspaper came to write a story about the diner's transformation. She found Bob and Mr. Chen sitting at the counter, looking through old photographs. "What's the secret?" she asked. "How did you turn conflict into community?" Mr. Chen smiled, looking at Bob. "Sometimes," he said, "the worst moments bring out the best in people. But only if we're willing to learn, to change, to see each other as human beings first." Bob added, "I thought I was buying a business, but what I really bought was a responsibility, to maintain a place where community happens." Mr. Chen and the Steele brothers taught me that profit isn't just about money. It's about the wealth of human connections. The story made the front page, not as a scandal about discrimination, but as a testament to community power and personal transformation. The headline read, "Local Diner Serves Up More Than Meals, A Story of Redemption and Community Spirit." The article ended with a quote from Pop of the Steele brothers, "We came here ready for a fight, but what we found was an opportunity for healing." That's the thing about community: when we stand together, we don't just protect what's right, we create something better. As summer turned to fall, the Sunrise Diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was a living example of how a community could transform conflict into connection, how mistakes could lead to growth, and how the simple act of sharing a meal could bridge any divide. As autumn painted the town in rich hues of red and gold, the Sunrise Diner's story took an unexpected turn. A young veteran, recently returned from deployment, walked through the door one quiet afternoon. He stood uncertainly at the entrance, his military bearing evident in his posture but his eyes revealing the lost look many veterans carried upon their return. Bob, who now made a point of personally greeting newcomers, noticed the young man's hesitation. Before he could move, though, Mr. Chen was already making his way over, his cane tapping gently against the floor. There was something about the elderly veteran that put people at ease. Perhaps it was the quiet understanding in his eyes, or the gentle way he carried his own experiences. "First time here?" Mr. Chen asked, gesturing to an empty seat at the counter. The young veteran nodded, introducing himself as David. He'd been back home for 3 months but found himself struggling to fit into civilian life. Someone at the VA had mentioned the diner, saying it had become a sort of unofficial veterans gathering place. What happened next would become another chapter in the diner's growing legacy of transformation. Mr. Chen didn't just offer David a meal, he offered him a connection to a community he desperately needed. As they talked over coffee, other regular customers naturally joined the conversation. A retired teacher shared information about veteran education benefits she'd helped others navigate. A local business owner mentioned he was looking for someone with leadership experience. Bob watched from behind the counter, marveling at how naturally these connections formed. The diner had become more than just a place for veterans, it was a bridge between military and civilian life, where the gap between these two worlds could be gently crossed over a hot cup of coffee and a sympathetic ear. The Steele brothers, true to their ongoing commitment, had started a weekly bikes and breakfast gathering at the diner. Every Saturday morning, the parking lot would fill with motorcycles, creating an impressive sight that drew curious onlookers. But it wasn't just about the bikes, it was about creating a space where veterans like David could find brotherhood and purpose. One Saturday morning, Pop pulled Bob aside to share something remarkable. "You know what's special about this place now?" he asked, gesturing around the busy diner. "It's not just about serving food anymore. It's about serving hope." The truth of Pop's words was evident in the scene before them. David was sitting with a group of veterans spanning 3 generations, from World War II to recent conflicts. They weren't just sharing war stories, they were sharing life experiences, job leads, and resources. The older veterans offered wisdom about adjusting to civilian life, while the younger ones helped their elderly counterparts navigate modern technology and social media. Jenny, who had worked at the diner through its darkest days, noticed another change. The customers weren't just eating and leaving, they were forming real connections. She watched as a young mother, struggling with her 3 kids during breakfast, received help from an elderly couple at the next table. The couple later became like grandparents to the children, a relationship that started over pancakes and coffee. The diner's transformation had sparked a chain reaction of kindness throughout the community. When word spread that David was looking for housing, a regular customer who owned rental properties offered him a reduced rate. When another veteran needed help moving, the Steele brothers organized a weekend volunteer group. These acts of kindness, big and small, became part of the diner's daily rhythm. Bob had started keeping a journal of these stories, titled, "More Than Just Coffee." Each entry captured a moment of connection, a life touched, a bridge built. He shared some of these stories on the diner's newly created social media pages, managed by David, who had found his own way to contribute to the community. The diner's new spirit of inclusion extended beyond veterans. Local teachers started holding after-school tutoring sessions in the quieter afternoon hours. A group of elderly residents found a welcoming space for their weekly card games. Young parents met for coffee while their children played in a newly created kids' corner, complete with books donated by the local library. One day, a health inspector who had known the diner for years came by for a routine check. After completing his inspection, he sat at the counter, visibly moved. "You know," he said to Bob, "I've been inspecting restaurants for 20 years. But this is the first time I've seen a place that nourishes souls as much as bodies." The inspector's words captured something essential about the diner's transformation. The physical space hadn't changed dramatically, the same worn booths, the same counter stools, the same vintage coffee makers still served their purpose. But the spirit of the place had undergone a profound metamorphosis. As the days grew shorter and the holiday season approached, Bob began planning something special. With input from Mr. Chen and the community, he was organizing the diner's first community Thanksgiving, a free meal service for anyone who needed it. The response from volunteers and donors was overwhelming, proving once again that the diner had become more than just a business. It was now the beating heart of a community that had learned the true meaning of service and connection. The first snowfall of the season transformed the Sunrise Diner into a picture-perfect scene from a holiday card. Warm light spilled from its windows onto the fresh snow, and the neon sign cast a cheerful glow across the white-blanketed parking lot. Inside, preparations for the community Thanksgiving were in full swing, but something even more remarkable was unfolding. Word about the diner's transformation had spread beyond the town limits. A local news station had picked up the story, focusing not on the initial conflict but on the powerful message of community redemption. The reporter, touched by what she discovered, spent several days filming the daily life of the diner and interviewing regulars. Mr. Chen had become something of a local celebrity, though he remained as humble as ever. Children would run up to him when he entered the diner, eager to hear new stories. He had a way of turning every interaction into a gentle lesson about respect, kindness, and the importance of community. The morning before Thanksgiving, Bob arrived at the diner to find a surprise. The Steele brothers, along with several other community members, had gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. They were setting up heated tents in the parking lot to accommodate the overflow crowd expected for the community Thanksgiving meal. "We couldn't let you do this alone," Pop explained, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "This is what community means, showing up before being asked." Inside, the diner had been transformed. Tables were arranged family-style, decorated with handmade centerpieces created by the local elementary school children. The walls were covered with thank-you notes and drawings, each one telling a story of how the diner had touched someone's life. Jenny coordinated a team of volunteer servers, many of whom were regular customers wanting to give back. The kitchen staff had been expanded with local chefs who had offered their services. Even competing restaurants in town had contributed dishes, recognizing that this event was about something bigger than business rivalry. David, the young veteran who had found his place in the community through the diner, had organized a special section for veterans and their families. He understood that holidays could be particularly challenging for those who had served, and he wanted to ensure they had a space where they felt understood and supported. As the day progressed, the diner became a hub of activity. People from all walks of life came together. Wealthy businessmen sat next to struggling single mothers, elderly veterans shared tables with young families, and longtime residents welcomed newcomers to the community. The barriers that often divided people seemed to dissolve over turkey and pumpkin pie. One particularly touching moment came when a bus arrived from the local retirement home. Among the elderly residents was a 95-year-old World War II veteran who hadn't been able to leave the facility in months. When he saw Mr. Chen and the other veterans, tears welled up in his eyes. "I thought everyone had forgotten about us old soldiers," he said softly. Mr. Chen took the man's hand and replied, "A soldier is never forgotten in this place. Here, we're all family." The local children's choir, which had been practicing for weeks, performed traditional holiday songs. When they sang "God Bless America," every veteran in the room stood at attention, creating a moment that brought tears to many eyes. Bob found himself overwhelmed by the scene before him. Just a few months ago, he had been focused solely on profits, viewing his customers as nothing more than transactions. Now, watching the diverse crowd sharing meals and stories, he understood that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Late in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young woman walked in, looking uncertain. She explained that her car had broken down on the highway, and she was trying to make it home for Thanksgiving. Without hesitation, the Steele brothers organized a team to help fix her car, while others made sure she had a warm meal and company while she waited. The spirit of giving continued throughout the day. People who came for a meal often stayed to help serve others. Children drew pictures for elderly guests. Teenagers helped clean tables and refill coffee cups. The diner had become a living example of what community could be. As evening approached, Mr. Chen gathered everyone's attention by gently tapping his cane on the floor. The room fell silent as he spoke. "In my long life," he began, "I have learned that the greatest battles we fight are not on foreign soil, but in our own hearts. The greatest victory is not defeating an enemy, but turning them into a friend. Today, I see no strangers here, only family I hadn't met before." Bob stood next to Mr. Chen, adding his own thoughts. "When I bought this diner, I thought I was purchasing a business. Instead, I was given the opportunity to be part of something much more precious, a community that knows the true meaning of giving thanks." The day's events were captured not just in photographs and videos, but in the hearts of everyone present. The local paper would later describe it as more than a meal, a demonstration of what happens when a community chooses love over indifference, understanding over judgment, and unity over division. As the sun set on that Thanksgiving day, the Sunrise Diner glowed with more than just electric light. It radiated the warmth of human connection, the strength of community bonds, and the promise that even the coldest hearts could be warmed by the power of compassion and understanding. 1 year had passed since the day Mr. Chen was turned away from the Sunrise Diner. The anniversary dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on the diner's windows and steam rising from the coffee cups of early morning customers. The transformation that had taken place over the past year was nothing short of remarkable. The parking lot, once nearly empty during off-peak hours, now hosted a mix of vehicles that told its own story: motorcycles belonging to the Steele brothers, cars with veteran license plates, family minivans, and even a few tour buses. The diner had become a destination, not just for its food, but for what it represented. Inside, the walls had become a living museum of community history. Photographs spanning decades showed the evolution of both the diner and the town. A special corner was dedicated to veterans, featuring service photos alongside current pictures, each pair telling a story of service and homecoming. Mr. Chen's photo held a place of honor, his young face in military uniform next to a recent picture of him surrounded by children during one of his storytelling sessions. Bob had arranged a special celebration to mark the anniversary, but not to commemorate the conflict. Instead, it was to celebrate the rebirth of community spirit that had emerged from that difficult moment. The event had drawn people from neighboring towns and even a few from across the state who had heard about the diner's story. The local high school had turned the diner's story into a social studies project about community activism and peaceful conflict resolution. Students interviewed Mr. Chen, Bob, and the Steele brothers, creating a documentary that would be shared with other schools. Their conclusion was powerful: real change doesn't come from confrontation alone, but from the willingness to learn, grow, and see the humanity in others. David, the young veteran who had found healing within the diner's walls, now ran a successful veteran outreach program. The diner served as his unofficial office, where he helped other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. "This place saved me," he often said. "Now I get to help it save others." The Steele brothers had expanded their presence beyond their weekly gatherings. They'd established a scholarship fund for veterans' children, named in honor of Mr. Chen. The first recipient was Jenny's son, who was heading to college to study social work, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed at the diner. On this anniversary morning, Mr. Chen arrived to find something new: a bronze plaque mounted by the entrance. It read, "The Sunrise Diner, where every sunrise brings new hope. Dedicated to all who serve our community, in uniform and in daily life." Below these words was a quote from Mr. Chen himself: "The greatest service we can offer is to see the humanity in each other." The day's celebration brought together all the threads of the past year's story. The mayor presented Mr. Chen with a key to the city, recognizing not just his military service, but his lifetime of quiet community building. Bob received an award from the Chamber of Commerce for transforming his business model to prioritize community impact alongside profit. But the most touching moment came when a group of young children, led by their teacher, presented a handmade book titled "Our Hero Mr. Chen." Each page contained a story of how the elderly veteran had touched their lives, from teaching them to play chess to showing them how to fold paper cranes during their lunch breaks at the diner. Pop took the microphone to share a reflection that brought tears to many eyes. "A year ago, we rode here ready to fight for respect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Instead, we learned that true respect isn't demanded, it's earned through understanding, given through compassion, and maintained through community." Bob stood next to Mr. Chen, their unlikely friendship a testament to the power of transformation. "This diner taught me that success isn't measured by what we take, but by what we give," Bob said. "Every morning when I unlock these doors, I'm not just opening a business, I'm opening my heart to this community." The celebration continued throughout the day, but it wasn't just about looking back. Plans were unveiled for the diner's future, including a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, teaching them to balance business success with community responsibility. The Steele brothers announced they would be expanding their veteran support initiatives to neighboring towns, using the diner's model as a template. As evening approached, Mr. Chen stood to address the gathered crowd. Despite his age, his voice carried the strength of conviction. "In war, I learned about humanity's capacity for conflict," he said. "But here, in this diner, I've witnessed humanity's even greater capacity for love, understanding, and growth. Every sunrise brings new hope, new chances to build bridges instead of walls." The day ended with a candlelit vigil in the parking lot, not in mourning, but in celebration of community spirit. As hundreds of candles flickered in the growing darkness, their light seemed to represent the countless individual acts of kindness that had transformed a moment of discrimination into a movement of unity. The Sunrise Diner's story had become more than just a tale of redemption. It was a blueprint for community healing, a testament to the power of second chances, and a reminder that the strongest communities are built not on perfection, but on the willingness to learn from mistakes and grow together. As the last candles flickered in the winter evening, Mr. Chen and Bob stood at the diner's entrance, watching families and friends sharing hugs and goodbyes. The neon sign cast its warm glow over the scene, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness, promising that tomorrow's sunrise would bring new opportunities to serve, to learn, and to grow, together, as a community.